This is the first video podcast for Chapter 7 on the impacts of landscape urbanization on hydrology. The Industrial Revolution marked a fundamental turning point in the history of hydrology on planet Earth. Now that's a pretty profound thing to say, but I think it is justified, as you'll see. And the reason for that is that the Industrial Revolution marked a time when humans had the technology, the population, and the will to really transform the landscape as it never could before. So the video podcast for Chapter 7 is going to be broken into 3 parts. The first part is going to deal with the process of urbanization itself. The second part is going to deal with how that urbanization changed aspects of hydrology. And then the third part will look at water quality and ecosystem changes. Then, in Chapter 8, we're going to look how these changes to the landscape and hydrology have in turn caused environmental feedbacks that have hurt human civilization. Well, the fundamental driver of the phenomenon that I'm talking about has been population growth. Now, you may be familiar with what we can call the J-shaped or exponential population growth curve for human species. And that is that, for a long time, human population was in the thousands to tens of thousands of individuals worldwide. But then, with the agricultural revolution, population really boomed. And ultimately, with the Industrial Revolution, we saw a fundamental change in the ability that humans have to transform the landscape. Here in the United States, we now have 300 million people. And although we have an overall low population density for the whole country, people are highly centralized in some relatively small areas, and we want to look at how that works. What this first graphic shows is that current growth trends are driven by demographic phenomenon. And so the areas of red with the highest blocks here, like in Florida, Texas, and the overall southwestern U.S., but especially in California, those are the areas that are fundamentally growing. More than 50% growth rates that are taking place. On the other hand, areas in the just east of the Rockies, here in the middle of the U.S., and in the northern states and northeast are seeing population declines that are anywhere from 20 to 60%. So it's true that people move around through time, and migration is the primary cause of the changes that you see here. Now, the real question you have to ask yourself, and I want you to answer this with the student response system, where do you want to live? And just to simplify the question, we can consider urban, suburban, lowland, rural, or isolated mountains. Of course, urban and suburban areas can be in a wide variety of landscape contexts, but regardless of which geographic region you want to be in, what is the urbanization context that you want to be in? So think about that for a minute and what you would say. And what I can tell you is when I've polled students, when I've given this lecture in class, the vast majority of people want to live in the suburban context. Very few people want to live on, the 9th floor of a high-rise building with, hearing lots of noise outside day and night and trains going by and everything else, although there are some that do. And so, it really turns out that suburban is the main driver, and we can see that that's not only true in class, but that's true for the American population and people that are moving to the United States as a whole. So 75% of Americans live in what are broadly called urbanized areas. But if you look at the population of the cities themselves only account for 10% of the total population of the United States. And that means that the vast majority of Americans, 65%, live in the region that we can think of as suburban sprawl, areas that have very low population densities. If we look at where people are, we can also see that there's a big difference between people living in coastal zones versus in non-coastal. So both areas are going up, but you can see that the density of people per square mile is really skyrocketing as we in coastal areas. And so people are attracted to water. Of course, many people immigrate to coastal cities from outside the United States, but these are the areas where people have always lived, along coasts, along rivers, and the American dream really is to live in an area where you have land of your own. That's illustrated by this graphic about Chicago. So The Illinois Planning Commission states that the population of the six-county Chicago region grew by only 4% from 1970 to 1990, but urbanized land use grew 35%. So it takes 9 times more land growth compared to population growth, and that's not characteristic of highly urbanized, dense development. That's characteristic of suburban sprawl. Over the last 20 years, more than 450 square miles of agricultural and vacant lands were converted to residential and commercial uses. So this just reflects, in part also flight as people leave the core areas of cities, valuing the benefits of a suburban lifestyle. But considering urbanization as a whole, we could see a dramatic transformation of the landscape in the post-industrial revolution era, and especially since World War II, but it was something that started before that. This graph, or this photo here, taken off of Google Earth, shows an area around San Jose. And you can look over this vast area of land. The thing that is the most powerful visually is this big interchange. It just takes up a vast area of land. I'm sure it's a testament to technological innovation to create interchanges that promote efficient transport of people. But look at the effect on the landscape, not only in terms of the size of its footprint, but in terms of creating barriers for water flow and creating like island biogeography, like patches of habitat that can't be organisms can't migrate from one to the other. So what is the process of urbanization? Now, there's no one way that this takes place, but in the American context, what I'm showing here is a very typical sequence that we have seen, especially in the eastern United States that's a little bit longer lived in its development. In the West, where cities have only grown since the Civil War, or in the post-industrial revolution era, you don't necessarily see this full process. But in the eastern half of the United States, you began in the pre-industrialized era, where you would have highly localized growth, and you might have people that are behind town walls, or if it's big enough, city walls, and so they're just not going to be likely to move out there unless they're woodsmen or farmers, and they're willing to take the risk of being attacked. But then, especially in the United States, in the late 1700s, you begin to see radial expansion, and it really was at the Civil War a marking point when rail became more prevalent. And after the Civil War, from 1865 to 1920, was really the domain in which rail played a big role in terms of creating satellite urban areas. What you see then is the conversion from rail to roads, and roads, you see that you don't just go from point A to B with no development in between. There's consistent development along the length of a road, and then finally, after that's well developed, you see the infill region between these spokes that are radiating out from the city. And with all that development, having rivers for industrial siting and then having these major roads are important aspects of what you can see. So this is very conceptual. Let me show you a specific example. University of Maryland at Baltimore County did a very nice project to look at the history of urbanization in the Baltimore and larger metropolitan Washington-Baltimore region. What they did is they just designated an area as urbanized or not urbanized, kind of on-off. So in this map that you see, Chesapeake Bay is shown in blue, and then the region of Maryland, kind of the physiographic region, is shown in green. The areas in yellow, these little specks that are here, are the areas of urbanization. So beginning in 1792, you primarily see one small blob at the location of Baltimore. Over the next 30 years, that blob grows, and it continues to grow. So over a 60-year period, you just see that very tight concentration of people in the town of Baltimore, in that dense urban core. That continues to 1878, but you start to see more satellite areas that are popping up. Not much change there, but a little of that in 1890. Now, by 1925, you really see these satellite areas all, popping up all around. And these are areas that are largely connected by rail. Then you come to 1938, and for the first time, you see the radials being continuous lines of urbanization, which are governed by roads. You see that they're relatively long and skinny, and over time, those start to fill in. So you see these well-defined lines. By 1953, they're still well-defined, but they're more blobs. You see a lot of more lateral spreading in those pictures. But you can also see that the core of the city is growing as well. By 1966, it kind of looks like somewhat like a starfish, like a big urban center, but then multiple, facets sticking out and developing. And then in the 1970s and 80s, it really picks up, just near complete infill in the middle, and then vast expansion. And there's really not much of a pattern to it anymore. Just broad-based expansion, generally tending towards Washington. If we look at it in the larger context of the region, here's Chesapeake Bay again, the Potomac River in the left. Washington, D.C. is right here, and Baltimore is there. You can see, again, the growth of those individual cities. By 1900, you can see the effect of rail in creating these blobs in the farther outlying region that you couldn't see before. And then there are some roads that are there, but by 1925, the roads are really taking off. And, over time, we see that this dual process of the concentric city itself growing, but also the radials that are growing out as well. And you can see that Washington grows faster than Baltimore, and that by 1992, they're pretty well merged into one overall megalopolis. This graph here looks at the whole nation, and you can see that, of course, much of the United States is relatively low density with low impervious surface area, and but the key is you can see, again, concentric rings associated with each individual city, with the highest density in the center and then decreasing in the rings away. You see the radials that are going outward, and then you see the infrastructure of all of the federal highways and state county roads that are connecting everything together. And so there's this preferential idea of dense growth in an urban core, suburban sprawl to the outlying region, and then sprawl taking place along roads. And where you see the more established regions in the eastern seaboard, the width of those bands of population around the roads are greater than they are in the other regions of the United States. Okay, so I'm going to stop there, and that's the end of part 1.